If you don't want any spoilers, you better turn this off now because I'm about to tell you exactly how the standings will look at the end of the 2021-22 NHL season. Good. This shouldn't upset anybody. Okay, obviously I'm kidding because the only thing that doing NHL season predictions guarantees is that people are going to come back at the end of the season and dunk on you when their team did way better than you said they were going to do. And especially in a season like this one where there are some tight division and playoff races, as well as a few teams that we don't really know what to expect from, there's definitely going to be some ones that are pretty wrong by the end of the season. But it's still fun to do, so what the heck, let's give it a shot. And we'll start with what looks to be a pretty top-heavy Atlantic division, with a few teams that could definitely end up winning this division, but I think I'm going to stick with the back-to-back defending champs in the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, yes, this team did lose a lot of depth. I mean, just to name a few of the guys they lost, they've lost Gaudreau, Gord, Coleman, Savard, and Johnson, as well as many more. But they still have one of the most talented rosters in the league and the best goaltender in the league. I know Jets fans might have something to say about that, but at the very least, he's one of the 2 or 3 best and certainly has the best lineup in front of him of those guys. The only real question here to me is whether or not the Lightning end up taking a page out of last year's book and sort of coasting into the playoffs and maybe falling back a space or two in the process, but saving their energy for that playoff run. If that happens, then there definitely are a couple of teams that can pass them up. But either way, they're certainly in the top 3, and we will be seeing this team in the playoffs. Coming in second in the Atlantic, I have the team who Tampa Bay copied the jerseys of in the Toronto Maple Leafs. And as long as they can stay healthy in goal with Campbell, this is definitely a roster that's built to succeed in the regular season and probably get them a pretty high seed in the playoffs. Of course, that having been said, this is definitely a fan base and maybe even a team that doesn't really care much what happens in the regular season, as long as when they get to the playoffs, they finally win at least a round and hopefully make a deep run. And third, I have the Boston Bruins, who, much like the other team in black and yellow, just never really seem to go away. Yes, a fair chunk of their core is starting to get on the older end, and they only added to that with Nick Foligno in the offseason, but really the only big change that this team had in the offseason was the changeover in goal to Linus Ullmark, who definitely is a pretty good goaltender and should be able to perform even better with a noticeably better team in front of him. With, of course, the biggest remaining question being whether or not Rask ends up back in Boston as part of a tandem with Ullmark. In fourth in the division, but still getting into the playoffs via a wildcard spot, I have the Florida Panthers, who are also coming off of the best regular season in franchise history, which was largely due to a number of players performing above what I think most people probably expected of them coming into the season. So there will be some aspect of them having to prove that last year wasn't just a fluke perfect storm of career seasons, and that this is something that they can sustain year over year. Of course, there's also questions for them in goal, as Drieger is now in Seattle, but still, this is a team that I think should be able to make a push into one of those wildcard spots. In fifth, and the first team that I have outside the playoffs looking in, is last year's Stanley Cup runner-up in the Montreal Canadiens. Now, this is definitely a team that could prove me wrong, as we saw a couple of different versions of the Canadiens last year. There's the version that started off the season, and we saw in the playoffs that looked like one of the better teams in the league. But then there was also the team that we saw for the last 2/3 of the season last year that definitely didn't look anywhere near like a playoff team. And while there still is a lot of young talent on this team, they are also missing some key pieces, with Danault and Perry having left in the offseason, Weber potentially out for good with an injury, and now Carey Price in the player assistance program for, well, we don't know how long, getting the help that he needs. So this definitely is not the team that we saw make that run to the Stanley Cup Finals, at least not in a few important ways. Though it will be exciting to see what Cole Caulfield can do with a full season. In 6th and 7th, I have Ottawa and Detroit respectively, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that neither one of these teams is super likely to be making a push to the playoffs, at least not just yet, though both of them do seem to be on the upswing and definitely have some hope on the horizon, especially as compared to where they've been for the last, well, fairly long period of time now. And as far as where they end up, again, I have Ottawa 6th, Detroit 7th, but I could definitely see that swapping, especially if Brady Tkachuk doesn't get his contract figured out by the start of the season and ends up holding out for the first month or so. And in 8th, really the first one that I don't think should be a surprise to anybody is the Buffalo Sabres. Really, the only thing exciting about this team to anybody outside of Buffalo, I guess, is the Jack Eichel situation. Though with that having been said, I think most of us are a little bit burned out on it. Though I do think it is to the credit of the Sabres that they didn't rush a trade with Eichel and are taking their time to make sure that they can, I would assume, get as much as they can out of him. Of course, it's still the Sabres, so time will only tell whether or not they get good value for Eichel, but yeah. Moving over now to the Metro Division, this is definitely one where I'm getting ready to be pretty wrong potentially about a couple of teams, as I could definitely see a pretty good argument for 6 of the teams in this division making the playoffs. Obviously, because I have 4 teams in the Atlantic making the playoffs, however, only 4 of them can, so 2 potential playoff teams are going to be on the outside looking in. But one team, and maybe the only team in this division that I think is pretty much a lock to make the playoffs, is the team that I'm going to put at number 1 in the New York Islanders. Now, this is definitely a team that is more built for the playoffs than they are for regular season success, and I could definitely see one of the other teams getting hot during the regular season and ending up in first in this division, but because I feel most confident about the Islanders making the playoffs, I decided to put them at number 1 as they definitely have the potential to end up there. Coming in second, and I could even see them making a push for that top spot, at least as far as regular season standings are concerned, I have the Washington Capitals, where really not a lot has changed since last year. Even the player that they lost in the expansion draft to Seattle ended up coming back to them. And now with Ovi back and his sights set on that Gretzky record, maybe a couple of years down the road, I think it's likely that we're going to see a lot of Ovi goals, which could lead to a pretty good regular season record. Whether or not that translates to playoff success, well, history would suggest maybe not, but at least as far as the standings in the regular season are concerned, I think this is a team that's likely to do well. Moving now, though, from one of the teams that had very little change during the offseason to one of the teams that maybe had the most turnover during this last offseason, in third, I have the Carolina Hurricanes, and one of the teams that I have as the biggest wild card coming into this year. Now, coming into the offseason, I wouldn't have had any problem putting them in third without really thinking too much about it. However, they seemingly unnecessarily dumped a whole bunch of their young talent as well as Dougie Hamilton, and while they did fill those spots with talent, let's just say there's some question marks about how they chose to do that. Coming in fourth in the division and locking in that last playoff spot, I have the New York Rangers. Now, this is definitely a team with plenty of young talent, whose window, I think, is ready to start opening up a little bit. Now, yes, I think it's still totally fair to say that it might be a little bit early to lock this team into the playoffs, especially with Crosby still in the division, and considering that they just spent their entire offseason getting ready to fight Tom Wilson a couple of times, rather than maybe making that playoff push. But either way, I think the chance is definitely there, and this team is going to start making the playoffs one of these years, so it might as well be this one. Coming in 5th and 6th in the division, I have the 2 Pennsylvania teams in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And well, I really could go either way with which team gets 5th and which gets 6th. I ended up putting Philadelphia actually in 5th and Pittsburgh in 6th, mostly just because Philadelphia has this whole weird thing with performing better every other season, and this is one of their better years, supposedly. And with Pittsburgh, there are some big question marks when it comes to the health of their star players, with Crosby and Malkin not even going to start the season, and Letang, well, let's just say we know about his history. Now, yes, Crosby doesn't sound like he's going to be out too long, and if he can stay healthy for the rest of the season after he comes back, this team probably does make the playoffs and takes the spot of either the Rangers or Hurricanes, depending on which one doesn't live up to their potential. But especially considering for the first time in a long time, this is an Olympic year with the NHL, and if he's healthy, Crosby definitely will be a part of that Canadian team. he's going to be playing a whole lot of extra hockey this year. So if there is a year where health is something to be worried about, it would definitely be this one. Hopefully it doesn't become an issue, and again, if not, they're probably in the playoffs, but I'm just not confident enough to say that it's going to be a healthy season for this team. Of course, with Philadelphia, again, we're banking on the every other year pattern panning out, with this being a better season for the Flyers, which, at least in goal, it can't be much worse. Carter Hart had a pretty miserable season last year and needs to have a bounce back this year, especially considering that their other option is Martin Jones. If Hart can't bounce back, it doesn't really matter too much what the rest of the team looks like in front of them, where there was also some turnover. But if he can play well, then he can probably drag this team into at least a shot at that wildcard spot. In 7th and 8th, I have another toss-up here between the Blue Jackets and Devils, but I ended up giving the edge to the Blue Jackets because they clearly have the better goaltending situation, and as long as Laine can have a bounce-back season of his own and play up to his potential, then this is still a team that won't necessarily be an easy out night to night. Meanwhile, with the Devils having added Graves and Hamilton to their blue line, this is still a team that I would expect to improve upon last year, which in itself was an improvement upon the year before that. So this is a team on the rise, but still, I think, especially in a very competitive division with lots of talent and more talented teams in it, I just don't see them getting too far away from that bottom spot. The Central Division, at least in the middle of it, is another pretty competitive division with a number of teams that are going to be fighting for playoff spots. But at least as far as the top spot is concerned, I don't think there's much question in who's going to end up there, as the Colorado Avalanche are pretty much the team that everyone expects to win this division. Coming off of having won the President's Trophy in a shortened season last year, really the only thing keeping a lot of people from picking this team again to win the Cup this year is the fact that they've continued to struggle to get out of the second round of the playoffs. As far as the regular season is concerned, though, this is still one of the most talented and well-rounded teams in the league. Really, the biggest turnover that they've seen since last year is losing Grubauer in free agency to Seattle and replacing him with Darcy Kemper. But with a much better team in front of him, Kemper should be up to the task and be able to perform at least comparably to how Grubauer was last year. Beyond Colorado, though, 2nd through 6th, maybe even 7th of this division doesn't have a whole lot separating the teams. Now, there still are a couple of teams that I think are fairly likely to fill those 2nd and 3rd roles, so we'll start with the team that I have in 2nd in the Winnipeg Jets. Of this middle group of 5 or 6 teams in this division, the Jets definitely have it best where it counts most, and that is between the pipes with Hellebuck in net. Plus, they seem to have, at least on paper, an improved defensive unit, and Pierre-Luc Dubois has to be able to show his talent at some point, even if it didn't necessarily show up right away after the trade last season. This is, I still think, probably the most well-rounded team outside of Colorado in the division, so I'll give them that spot in 2nd. If they don't get it, I still think they end up 3rd, and I would have a hard time seeing them out of the playoffs. Another team that I could see just as easily in 2nd, but I'll put them in 3rd, would be the Minnesota Wild. Now, for the Wild, a lot of this depends on Kirill Kaprizov being able to show that last season wasn't just a one-hit wonder and that he does actually turn out to be as exciting of a player as he was last year. Plus, there's also the fact that with the buyouts they made this season, that cap recapture is going to start hitting hard next year. So, at least for the Wild, this is pretty much an all-in season before they have to start spending a whole bunch of their cap space on players that are no longer playing for them. Coming in the 4th spot and getting into the playoffs via wildcard, again, I could really see just about any one of the remaining teams in this division making a fight to get this spot. Outside of maybe the team I have in 8th, but still, I do have to pick one, so I'm going to go with the St. Louis Blues, and here, I'm really just betting on the potential that this team has. They have plenty of issues of their own. I mean, there's the fact that Tarasenko still wants out via trade, and that Binnington seems to be getting worse and worse the farther they get from that Stanley Cup win. But still, the potential is definitely there for this team to be able to make the playoffs, and potentially even win a round or two. though losing Schwartz and Dunn also didn't help. While the Blues try to get their ship righted and stop sliding farther and farther from 2019, in 5th and also making the playoffs, I have a team who seems to be headed in the opposite direction. At least on the ice anyway, that being the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, putting aside everything that's been going on off the ice for this team for just a second, last season this was a feisty team on the ice, more so than I think a lot of people were expecting. And then in the offseason, they added the reigning Vezina champion for pretty much nothing, as well as both Caleb and Seth Jones. Even if they added Seth Jones on a contract that, let's just say it doesn't necessarily look like it could age all that well. But regardless, at least for this year, this team does look like it should be even better than a team that almost made some noise last year. So then in 6th place, and now just outside of the playoffs, I have the Dallas Stars, who I do think have playoff potential, and last year they did just barely miss the playoffs in 5th in their division, even after having gone through probably more adversity off of the ice than any other team in the league, with COVID issues, a record-setting blizzard in Texas, and plenty of injuries. So as long as they can not have as bad of a time off the ice as they did last year, which I think should be pretty doable, then this team definitely should be able to improve, and maybe they do make it into the playoffs, especially with, again, I think it being likely that 5 Central teams end up in the postseason. And in 7th, I have the team who did just barely keep Dallas out of the playoffs last year in the Nashville Predators. Now, for the Predators, again, they did make the playoffs last year, but losing Pekkarinne, even though they have UC Saros still, but also losing Ryan Ellis, I just don't think that this team is headed in the right direction right now to be able to once again squeak into a playoff spot. But they're certainly far from the worst team in the division, and I still think have an outside shot at potentially making the postseason. Of course, that worst team in the division, I think, is almost as obvious as the best team in the division, that being the team that is newly added into the Central in the Arizona Coyotes. The Coyotes, even putting aside that they're getting kicked out of their Glendale Arena at the end of this season, this team already did not have a particularly great year last year, and then had as much of a fire sale as they possibly could have in the offseason, to a point where there's even a chance that they could compete with Buffalo for that first overall pick, or at least the best odds at the first overall pick. And that just leaves the Pacific Division, which, let's just say there's a reason that I feel fairly confident that 5 teams will be making the playoffs from the Central. Now, there are 1, maybe 2 teams that are pretty much locks to make the playoffs from the Pacific, which then just leaves 1 playoff spot that a few teams are fighting for. But we'll start with those 2 that are going to end up in the playoffs here. In first, and I think this is a fairly unanimous first, we have the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, Vegas did take a bit of a gamble in the offseason on Robin Lehner. Not that Lehner's not a good goaltender, but they took away any safety net that he had by trading away their reigning Vezina winner in Marc-Andre Fleury, and making sure to stab him in the back in the process. That having been said, this is easily still the most well-rounded team in the division, and with their constant all-in mentality, I don't think that's likely to change as the season goes on, even if they could still use some help at center, which is pretty much the one thing that you can't say about the team that is pretty much guaranteed to end up second in the division, in the Edmonton Oilers. For the Oilers, while still being a very good team, at least in the regular season, they're pretty much everything else that Vegas isn't. They have easily the most center talent of any team in the league and can match that with some pretty good forwards on their top 2 lines. But defensively, there's still a lot of questions here, and I don't know that Duncan Keith answers a whole lot of them. And in net, well, they're definitely far from the worst team in net, but I think that they would be hard to be placed anywhere other than middle of the pack across the NHL. Of course, McDavid, Draisaitl, and the supporting cast they have on the forward end are still likely to carry this team to a very good record in the regular season, but much like the Leafs, there are some big questions to be answered in the first round of the playoffs. And that brings us to that third and final spot that, by NHL rule, is guaranteed a playoff spot in the Pacific Division. And there are 4 teams that I think all have a pretty decent shot at getting this 4th spot. all of whom have pretty massive question marks and could end up anywhere from 3rd to 6th in this division when all is said and done. But in the 3rd spot, and feel free to get angry at me and call me a homer in the first season, but I think the Seattle Kraken actually do have the best shot at getting that 3rd spot. And that is largely due to their defensive and goaltending strengths. Now, yes, it's true that on the forward end, this team doesn't necessarily look like they're going to be blowing too many teams out across the course of the season or lighting up the scoreboard a whole heck of a lot. But on the defensive end, they do have one of the stronger cores of any team in the division, and at least to me, they've got the strongest goaltending tandem. Plus, we've seen over the last couple of years with the Islanders that you don't necessarily have to score all that many goals during the course of a season to get into the playoffs. And then once you're in the playoffs, well, defense and goaltending do tend to play a lot better there than they necessarily do during the regular season. Of course, yes, this still is a brand new team and by its nature has as many question marks, if not more, than any other team in the league. So they could still end up in 6th place in this division almost as easily as they could end up in 3rd. But I think that with how hard it's going to be to score on them, 3rd is a little bit more likely. And the 2 teams that I have in 4th and 5th that I think are most likely to kick Seattle out of that 3rd spot would be the Calgary Flames and Vancouver Canucks respectively. Now, I could just as easily see the Canucks finish above the Flames as the Flames above the Canucks, as both of these teams have a lot of questions coming out of last season. I think the Flames have a little bit more of a well-rounded team, and if Markstrom can bounce back, maybe a little bit better in net, but that's definitely not a given, especially considering how last year went. For the Flames, this season will revolve around, again, Markstrom bouncing back in net, also this team figuring out how to gel and come together in the locker room, and rally around Tkachuk in a way that they really didn't do last year, and in fact kind of seem to be doing the opposite of, which is definitely going to be easier said than done, especially after having lost their longtime captain in Mark Giordano. Meanwhile, with the Canucks, with the COVID issues they had last season, few teams, outside of probably the Stars, had things rougher off the ice than Vancouver did. So there's a lot that can be said about their issues last year and their massive drop in the standings being due to what they had going on elsewhere, but unlike the Stars, they really never even showed any signs of being able to bounce back from that, so we're going to have to wait and see if that can happen this season. And for what little it's worth, especially considering Pettersson and Hughes didn't play for the vast majority of it, the preseason didn't go particularly well for Vancouver either, so there's still a lot of question marks with this team, even if the talent is there to have a bounce back year. And finally, in 6th place, and the last team that I could see making some noise in this division, even if I don't know it's super likely they end up jumping all 3 of the teams in front of them to make the playoffs and get that 3rd spot, I have the LA Kings. Now, last year, like Ottawa and Detroit, they showed that surprisingly this team might be ready to compete earlier than we expected them to. Though, again, like those 2 teams, I think it's probably still a year or two too early for them to realistically be competing for a playoff spot, even in a Pacific Division where the door is pretty much wide open. That having been said, because of the way the Pacific Division is, it's not completely out of the question that they could make the playoffs, and either way, they're likely to be a pain going forward for years to come. Meanwhile, the team in this division headed quickly in the other direction would be the San Jose Sharks, who are now coming off of back-to-back very disappointing seasons and have not been able to find the goal scoring that they were able to find during their playoff runs, and without Patrick Kane, I don't think that that's super likely to change this season. Now, as far as the locker room is concerned, they might be better off without Kane, but again, not having a player with his talent definitely doesn't help things on the ice. And that's even without mentioning that they're throwing a relatively young first-time starting goaltender in net to take the vast majority of the starts over the course of this season in Adin Hill, who's also new to the team and doesn't have all that great of a defense in front of him to help alleviate some of those first-time starter issues that he could have. So while Erik Karlsson and ownership might not be ready to admit that they're headed towards a rebuild, I think it seems pretty inevitable at this point that a rebuild is quickly coming on the horizon. But even with the Sharks being a bit of a mess, they are also far from being the worst team in their division. as there's still the Anaheim Ducks, who, while they don't look like they're going to be quite as bad as either Arizona or Buffalo, they are very much more in the running for those best odds at the first overall pick than they are for anything close to a playoff spot, much less outside of the bottom of the division. So there you go, my last minute projections for the 2021-22 NHL season. Again, as far as playoff spots are concerned, I have in the Atlantic, Tampa Bay, Toronto, Boston, and Florida all making the playoffs. In the Metro, the Islanders, Capitals, Hurricanes, and Rangers making the playoffs. And of course, that means Toronto and Boston would face off in the first round, which I'm sure pretty much everybody outside of Leafs fans wants to see, but yeah, I'm not sure Leafs fans would be super excited about. In the Central, again, 5 teams make it there. It's Colorado, Winnipeg, Minnesota, St. Louis, and Chicago, with Dallas just outside looking in, but again, very likely they could make a push. And in the Pacific, only 3 teams being Vegas, Edmonton, who are locks, and then Seattle, because, again, I think that's the best, most well-rounded team of the rest, though Calgary and Vancouver definitely could make a push for that spot. And if I had to pick a Stanley Cup final out of that group, well, it would be hard to go against what I thought it was going to be last year in Colorado versus Tampa Bay, but I'll mix things up a little bit and say Colorado versus the Islanders, who finally get over the hump and get into the finals, though I'll pick Colorado to end up winning it. But as that will bring us to the end of this one, if you haven't already, please do feel free to let me know down in the comment section what you think of these rankings, what you would change, or what maybe you agree with. Otherwise, if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that I would appreciate you using. And until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other.